At 0830 local time, in the Spratly Islands, the USS Decatur was conducting another routine freedom of navigation patrol near Gavin Reef. But a few minutes into the transit, Decatur's radar picture painted a fast-moving contact sliding in from the port quarter, rear left, closing with intent. A planned Type 052C destroyer, the Lanzhou. In a normal encounter, this is where the shadow game stays boring. A few thousand yards of standoff, parallel courses, radio calls that sound polite but mean, we're watching you. Not today. Lanzhou approached from behind and established itself as the overtaking vessel. And in maritime law, Colreg's Rule 13, that's not a suggestion, that's a requirement. The overtaking ship must keep clear. If you're overtaking, you don't get to claim you were cut off. You're the one responsible for staying out of trouble. So if this got dangerous, the paperwork would be simple. The problem is Beijing wasn't trying to win paperwork. Beijing was trying to win video. Inside Decatur's bridge team, the mood shifted from routine to surgical focus. The junior officer of the deck watched the contact's bearing drift. A constant bearing with decreasing range isn't shadowing, it's collision math. It means the other ship is set up to hit you unless someone changes something, speed, heading, or sanity. And Lanzhou didn't change sanity. She changed speed. The Chinese destroyer accelerated, closing faster, tighter, moving like it had one job. Get close enough that the Americans would flinch first. But here's what the plan captain was really testing. American restraint. Because the US Navy is trained to prevent a mishap even when the other side is trying to manufacture one. In other words, China's tactic only works if the US remains the adult in the room. At around 0833, the track went from aggressive to suicidal. Lanzhou gunned her engines and executed a hard turn to starboard, cutting directly across Decatur's bow at a distance of just 45 yards. To people on land, that's half a football field. To two warships moving at sea speed, it's basically breathing distance. At roughly 30 knots, a ship covers about 15 yards per second. Do the math. 45 yards is about 3 seconds. 3 seconds for an 8,000-ton destroyer to choose between collision and a radical maneuver. And now at the part that makes this even worse. Because Decatur wasn't just dealing with a reckless intercept. Post-incident reporting raised concerns that the commanding officer at the time was dealing with a culture of concealing engineering casualties. You don't need to know every mechanical detail to understand the danger here. If a ship is operating with reduced propulsion flexibility, something like a locked shaft scenario, your ability to throw the rudder and power through a high-rate turn gets compromised, meaning your 3 seconds turns into 2. And 2 seconds is where physics stops being polite. Then the Chinese destroyer did something that turned "we're being aggressive" into "we're prepared to collide." She deployed fenders. Large rubber bumpers over the side. You don't hang fenders for diplomacy. You hang fenders because you're ready for impact. That's the moment every sailor on Decatur understood the actual message. We are willing to hit you. On the American bridge, the response was immediate and brutally professional. Helm hard to starboard. Gas turbines surged. The ship's mass bit into the water. They didn't win the encounter. They survived it. The ships missed by a margin so thin the wake nearly washed across the American deck. Not metaphorically, physically. That's how close it was. Now, most headlines describe this as dangerous seamanship, but the real weapon here wasn't just steel, it was water. Because at these distances, you're not only steering a ship, you're wrestling with hydrodynamics. When two large hulls pass close together, the water between them has to move faster to squeeze through the narrowing gap. As fluid velocity increases, pressure drops, creating a low-pressure corridor that can pull the ships together. It's the Venturi effect scaled up to warship size. And once you enter that zone, rudder authority can get weird. You can be doing the right thing and still get sucked toward the other hull. So in that 45-yard moment, Decatur wasn't just fighting a Chinese destroyer. She was fighting a law of nature. And that's what made the tactic brilliant in the ugliest way. You force the other ship into a physics trap. Then you film their evasive move and call it retreat. No missiles fired, no shots. But the risk to life is identical to combat. Gray zone warfare in its purest form. Coercion by collision math. And Beijing was betting the US Navy would always be rational enough to avoid a crash. They were right. Which is exactly why the tactic keeps returning. Because the incentive structure rewards recklessness. But 2018 wasn't the end. It was the prototype. 5 years later, the plan ran the same basic play again, only this time they refined it into something even more cinematic. June 3, 2023, the theater shifts to the Taiwan Strait. The USS Chung-Hoon, a Flight 2A Arleigh Burke, conducts a rare joint transit with the Royal Canadian Navy frigate HMCS Montreal. That second ship matters, because it adds something Beijing can't wave away later, a witness. And Chung-Hoon is heavier than Decatur, displacing over 9,200 tons. More mass means more inertia, more time to stop, more time to turn, more time to regret. Then the contact appears, the plan type 052DL destroyer, the Suzhou. And the setup is familiar. Suzhou approaches from the port side aft, again positioning itself as the overtaking vessel. Again, Rule 13. Again, obligation to stay clear. Again, ignored. Suzhou gunned her engines and veered to starboard, cutting across Chung-Hoon's bow at roughly 150 yards. People hear 150 and think safe. It's not safe when the goal isn't passing, it's controlling. And this is where the 2023 incident shows evolution. It wasn't a single cut. It was a planned sequence. On the bridge of HMCS Montreal, Captain Paul Mountford watched the intercept unfold and described a detail that matters. The Chinese crew announced the maneuver by radio before executing it, effectively telling the Americans to move or a collision would happen. That's not confusion. That's premeditation with a countdown. Suzhou executed the first cut, crossing from port to starboard across Chung-Hoon's bow. Then came the pivot. After crossing, Suzhou turned back to port and carved an S-shaped path directly in front of the U.S. destroyer, forcing Chung-Hoon to slow dramatically, reportedly down near 10 knots. This wasn't close. It was blocking. A physical demonstration that China could decide how fast a U.S. warship moves, inside international waters, on camera. And the timing was a message. Because as ships were playing chicken in the strait, both the U.S. Secretary of Defense and China's Defense Minister were in Singapore for the Shangri-La dialogue, talking about stability. While diplomats discussed guardrails, sailors were staring at the only guardrail that matters, the distance between hulls. This maneuver was kinetic punctuation. Mind your business. Now zoom out, because the real story isn't two close calls. It's the doctrine behind them. The core is the weaponization of the coal regs, especially Rule 13, overtaking, and the logic of crossing situations. Here's the trick. Start as the overtaking vessel, legally required to keep clear. Then cut across the bow to force a moment where the other ship has to maneuver. If the U.S. ship holds course and there's a collision, China can claim American interference. If the U.S. ship swerves or slows, China gets the video clip and the narrative. They yielded. That's why this is so dangerous. Because it's a tactic designed to convert American professionalism into Chinese propaganda. No missiles, no gunfire. Yet the escalation risk is enormous, because the physical consequences of a collision between modern destroyers are not embarrassing, they are catastrophic. A high-speed impact is steel tearing, fuel rupturing, fires, flooding, sailors trapped behind buckled bulkheads. And if the collision happens in the wrong area, near critical compartments, weapons spaces, or simply produces mass casualties, what begins as an incident becomes a crisis that political leaders cannot ignore. That's how you go from an unsafe maneuver to national retaliation dynamics without a single shot fired. China's bow cut tactics assume one thing will always be true, that the U.S. will always be the rational actor who refuses to trade a $2 billion warship for pride. So Beijing pushes right up to the edge, because the U.S. Navy doesn't want to be the side that turns a near miss into a tragedy. But that logic has a flaw. It depends on perfect conditions. Because restraint doesn't remove danger. It concentrates danger into the margins. One mechanical limitation, one moment of misread closure rate, one sea state push, 1 second of hesitation at the helm. That's all it takes. And then physics makes the decision for everyone. That's why the pattern matters. The plan has moved from pure intimidation to refined choreography. Captains trained to hit sweet spots where the other side must react, but the intercept stays just below the threshold that triggers a defensive response. Which tells you this isn't rogue seamanship. It looks like a system, a repeatable method. Create a forced choice dilemma, film the response, claim dominance. And the strategic reality is brutal. The boundary in the Indo-Pacific isn't a line on a map. It's measured in yards between hulls. In 2018, the gap was 45 yards. In 2023, the gap was 150 yards plus an S-turn blockade. Different numbers, same purpose. And as long as one side keeps testing and the other side keeps refusing to crash, the temptation to push closer never goes away. Until one day, the distance shrinks past the point where skill and professionalism can outrun hydrodynamics. And the next unsafe intercept isn't a headline. It's a disaster. Because it's easier to start a crisis at sea than it is to stop one once steel is already committed, once water is already pulling, and once a 3-second window closes. For now, the US Navy keeps doing what it's done for decades, holding course, documenting everything, refusing to be baited into catastrophe. But every time a Chinese destroyer tries to weaponize the rules and the physics, it makes one thing clearer. The most dangerous weapon in these encounters isn't a missile. It's the assumption that the margin will always be there.